Today's episode of What If Discussed is brought to you by Policy Genius.
At what point will we attain type 2 status? Well, remember, now we're talking about centuries to maybe 1,000 years into the future. This means building the first starships. So we're going to go far beyond the solar system and reach out to the nearby stars.
So Pete, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
You seem surprised that I'm asking you how you're doing.
It's just an odd way to start. You say it every week, but it seemed like you were putting me on the spot for some reason.
Well, I mean, in this case, I was actually concerned. I am concerned with how you're doing, but more in the context of energy. How are you feeling energetically?
Here we're sitting in August of 2020 and is this the tail end of the pandemic? Really? I don't know. I think like a lot of people who are working from home, not everybody's working from home, but I am. A lot of people are taxed. They've expended a lot of their energy.
They're low. And I mean, I think most people would answer the question the same way. Most people feel they don't have enough energy. They could use more energy because at the end, we're all energy, including our planet.
Okay, now I see where you're going with this. You're talking about, and because of probably the topic of today's show, everything is energy.
Everything is energy, and in this case, how planets are sort of categorized according to the Kardashev scale, which is something we'll get into later. There are type 1, type 2, type 3 civilizations, and it's according to how much energy they can harness from, in this case, type 2, that you can harness from the sun.
We have done a few Kardashev scale-like videos on What If, and I don't recall, are we a type 1?
Well, bad news. We're not a type 1 yet. We're actually type 0, which is not something that
depressing.
It feels depressing, but we have nowhere to go but up.
Okay.
Which is another way to look at it. It's kind of like type 2 would be more like solar power on steroids.
Okay, solar power on steroids. So it's like the sun, but we're getting all of our power from the sun. We're able to harness all that power from the sun and store it too.
Yes,
right?
and store it, which as you can imagine would allow us to do a whole bunch of things, not things that I would necessarily understand, nor did I really understand this prior to probably hours ago. But that's why we have guests on the show, because we want people to be able to come on and explain some of these complicated topics, like what if Earth became a type 2 civilization. And in this case, we're lucky enough to have somebody who's a bit of an expert on the subject and who we've also had on the show before.
Yeah, we have. It's Professor Pr.Michio Kaku, who's extremely smart and well-respected and followed by a lot of people.
And really one of the people who are most cited and quoted when you're talking about today's what if the Earth became a type 2 civilization.
Pr.Michio Kaku is known as a futurist, a great communicator, and a popularizer of science. He first graduated summa cum laude from Harvard University in 1968 and received his PhD from Berkeley in 1972. Kaku has expertise in several fields, such as hadronic physics, supersymmetry, supergravity, superstring theory, and quantum physics. He's also quite the media maven, with multiple best-selling books to his name, including his most recent, The Future of Humanity. He also hosts 2 radio shows and appears regularly in television series exploring space, physics, and the future. He's currently the City College of New York's Henry Seamat Professor of Theoretical Physics, where he's been teaching for 35 years.
Professor Kaku, welcome back to What If Discussed.
Glad to be on the show.
And we're always glad to have you. And
for sure.
As Peter and I talked about off the top, it's a complicated subject, this type 1, type 2 civilizations, if you don't know the Kardashev scale.
Yeah.
And of course, I think we did our best to try to understand it and explain it, but this is why you're here, because obviously this is something that you're considered one of the experts on this planet. So first of all, please clarify, what is the Kardashev scale and what is a type 1, type 2, type 3 civilization?
Well, we physicists are tired of talking about flying saucers and little green men and speculating about life in space. I'm a physicist. We use energy to rank civilizations in outer space. A type 1 civilization is planetary. They consume all the energy that they receive from the sun. For example, they control the weather. A type 2 is stellar. They control all the energy output of the mother sun, sort of like the Federation of Planets in Star Trek. They've colonized a few of the neighboring planets, neighboring star systems, but not much more. Then there's type 3. Type 3 is galactic. They roam the galactic space lanes. They can harness the energy of 100 billion stars in the galaxy, sort of like Star Wars. Star Wars would be an example of a type 3 galactic civilization. Now, what are we? Do we play with the weather, play with volcanoes, and play with earthquakes? Do we play with the sun? Do we play with black holes throughout the galaxy? No. We are type 0. We don't even rate on this scale. We get our energy from dead plants, oil and coal. But we are about 100 years away from attaining type 1 status. For example, the internet. What is the internet? It is the first type 1 telephone system to be unleashed in this century. What language will this type 1 civilization speak? Well, already English and Mandarin Chinese are the two greatest languages on the internet. And what is the European Union? What is NAFTA? What are all these trade blocs? The beginning of a primitive type 1 planetary economy. Now, if you keep this scale up, at what point will we attain type 2 status? That is, leave this solar system and start to explore the nearby stars. Well, you just take out a slide rule or a calculator. You can calculate that in just a few thousand years, we will be type 2 like Captain Kirk. Now, Captain Kirk lives in the 23rd century, so that's about right. A little early, but still well on the scale that Nikolai Kardashev formulated in the 1960s. Then you hit type 3 in about 100,000 years.
Wow.
And why is that? Because that's the energy that you attain, the Planck energy. The Planck energy is the energy of space-time. It's when space becomes unstable, wormholes develop, black holes, gateway, hyperspatial gateways through space and time. That's the Planck energy. The Planck energy is a quadrillion times more powerful than the Large Hadron Collider outside Geneva, Switzerland. And why do I mention that? Because once you attain the Planck energy, wormholes, maybe even time travel, is a possibility.
Wow.
Let's bring it back down to Earth and talk about type 2. I was asking off the top whether a type 2 civilization was simply like solar power on steroids.
Yes.
Now, I know you're not going to quote me in your next book as a genius insight, but how close is that idea to what type 2 means?
Well, type 2 does not mean simply getting sunlight from the sun. It means playing with the sun itself. For example, a Dyson sphere would envelop the entire sun with a sphere to absorb 100% of the energy output of a star. That's a Dyson sphere, and astronomers think that, well, we're not sure, but we may have the signals from some potential candidates of being a type 2 civilization in outer space. There's a star called Tabby star, which drops in intensity by about 25%. Some people think that maybe a gigantic Jupiter-sized planet moves in front of the star, absorbing all its energy, and perhaps that is a Dyson sphere in outer space.
Oh.
And a type 2 civilization would be like Star Trek. The Federation of Planets, they've colonized a small quadrant of the galaxy, would be a type 2 civilization.
Energy is something that I don't know, mean we don't talk about energy, because we talk about energy, but as important as energy is to our day-to-day lives and our functions on this planet, survival, but even beyond, you'd think we'd have even more focus. I think we take it for granted. Obviously, you just walk into a room, turn on a light switch, etc. But as you said earlier, we still are at a pretty primitive level of harnessing energy, which is, again, fossil fuels. How important is it that we, let's say, fast forward our harnessing of solar power to not only get to type 2 civilization one day, but to expedite the evolution of this species?
Well, let's take a look at it historically. Throughout most of human history, for 99% of human history, we had about a quarter of a horsepower per person. The strength of your left hand and right hand. And that's it, folks. That was the energy output for most of human civilization, about a quarter of a horsepower. Then when we domesticated horses about 10,000 years ago, we went from a quarter of a horsepower to 1 horsepower. And that began what is called civilization. Cities, armies, empires began to be formed. And then just 300 years ago, we discovered the steam engine. And as a consequence, we went from 1 horsepower to maybe 10 horsepower in a buggy, in a locomotive. Now, of course, you have access to thousands of horsepower. And in fact, we're going to use that energy to rocket into outer space. So you see that the progress of civilization can be mapped by the progress in energy harnessing, that we've been able to harness thousands of horsepowers for 1 astronaut, while before it was only the strength of your left hand and your right hand. Now, you mentioned energy sources of the future. Solar is one, but there's another one I think that is even more important, and that's fusion power. Yeah. Now, fusion power is still a few decades away, but fusion power is the power of the universe.
Wow.
It's what makes the sun shine. It's what makes the stars twinkle. And we're going to be able to, I think, in a few decades, harness that fusion power on the planet Earth to give us unlimited amounts of energy from seawater. Seawater is the basic fuel for fusion plants. And we have one in France. It's called the ITER fusion reactor in Kardashev, France, built by the European Union with the help from the United States and Russia and Japan. And we hope to get fusion off the ground in the coming decades.
Well, just so we book you in it far enough in advance, I'd just like you to put in your calendar that when that happens, we'd like to have you back on the show. Because ideally, you and I would still be alive, Peter. We'd still be doing What If Discussed. But like right now, I would say let's just put a pin in that for now. Let's say we jump in the time machine and go right there, the What If time machine. Peter, start it up. Yes, we haven't used it in a while. So let's say all the theoreticals are behind us. We are now at that point where we are a type 2 civilization. What are some of the kind of cool things that people would be sort of fascinated by that a type 2 civilization as Earth would be able to do, whether it's controlling the weather, the atmosphere, blowing asteroids out of the sky? Like, what are some of the things that we should be able to expect as a type 2 civilization?
Well, remember, now we're talking about centuries to maybe 1,000 years into the future. Well, we'll have pretty much colonized the entire solar system out to Pluto and maybe out to the nearby stars. We're going to build the first starship, perhaps within 100, 200 years. NASA already has the 100-year Starship program looking at potential propulsion systems for a starship. For example, antimatter engines, fusion engines, even ramjet fusion engines. These are all possible engines for starships. Now, we're not talking warp drive. To get warp drive, you'd have to be type 3. But by the time you're type 1 and aspiring toward type 2, this means building the first starships. So we're going to go far beyond the solar system and reach out to the nearby stars. There's even a program called the Breakthrough Starshot program. Stephen Hawking, my late colleague, was a member of that program. And he believed that, yes, we should build the first starship. Not in a few hundred years, but in this century, just in this century, build the first starship.
Well, one of the great things about having you is that regardless of where we're at individually or collectively, I'm always optimistic and excited after I speak to Michio Kaku, because you see the future in such a way that is, especially in these times, encouraging and exciting, and wow. It gives us a reason to sort of, look forward beyond our sort of day-to-day problems and be excited about the future.
It's interesting because we talked about, Homo sapiens being around for 200,000 years.
Yes.
And Professor Kaku saying, all you had for power was, half a horsepower. Yes. And now we're 100 years away, probably.
Yes. And I mean, 100 years away, we couldn't fly. Or sorry, 100, a little over 100 years ago, we couldn't fly. So, and then, 50 years later, 60 years later, we're sending people to the moon. So
incredible.
As you are always adept at doing, you get us sort of steered in the right direction. We're going to have Professor Kaku on later. If you want to listen to this full in-depth interview beyond our conversation that we just had, click on the link below, because a special treat, we are going to be breaking down your most recent New York Times bestseller, The Future of Humanity. I don't think it's overstating it to say that this is one of those times where you want to be thinking about the future of humanity, but especially the insights and the visionary perspectives that you have in the book. Give us a little idea of what we're going to be hearing about and what people can expect to find in the book, The Future of Humanity.
Well, the dinosaurs did not have a space program.
They did not.
That's why they're not here today. There are no dinosaurs joining us for this interview today because they got wiped out. They were clueless. They didn't know what hit them. Well, we do have a space program, and it's inevitable that we're going to have crises. For example, volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, pandemics. We know they're going to be crises of the future, and we need an insurance policy. An insurance policy to make sure that humanity survives no matter what catastrophes hit the planet Earth. And the main stumbling block preventing that was a 4-letter dirty word, cost. It cost $10,000 to put a pound of anything into orbit around the planet Earth. That's your weight in gold. Think of your body made out of solid gold. That's what it costs just to put you in orbit around the planet Earth. Well, now prices are dropping because Elon Musk and others are perfecting the reusable rocket, because of competition, because of private-public collaboration. The price of space travel is dropping like a rock. This means that in the future, mom and dad may be able to go to outer space. And I would even predict that our grandkids may have the option of honeymooning on the moon.
Cool.
Not the dark side of the moon, though, because that's not a good way to start a relationship.
A little more private.
So again, more with Dr. Kaku about everything future of humanity. You don't want to miss this. So click on the link below, and you're going to get a really in-depth dive into a rabbit hole that's going to cover so many topics about the short, medium, and long-term future of humanity on this planet. Dr. Kaku talked about insurance policies, Peter. It sounds like the perfect segue to talk about our friends at Policy Genius.
Well, Professor Kaku is not necessarily an insurance salesman, but...
He is a genius. He's possibly not a policy
definitely
genius.
Not a policy genius. Well, Policy Genius is an insurance marketplace, and there comes a time in life when it becomes evident that people need some life insurance. But the world being a little topsy-turvy right now.
It certainly is.
Pandemic, it's a deadly pandemic, and you might be thinking, okay, well... Can you buy life insurance when there's a deadly pandemic? Is
it inflated?
Will they cover me?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the short answer is yes. You can buy life insurance during a pandemic, and if you have loved ones, depending on your income, it's a really good idea. Best place to go for the best rate? Policy Genius. Policy Genius, like I say, is an insurance marketplace. They're in contact with the life insurance companies on their platform every day, keeping track of the insurance market so that you don't have to. They've got the expertise to cover you quickly and at the best price. They compare quotes from the top life insurance companies all in one place. Just takes a few minutes to compare quotes from the top insurers, and that saves you a lot of legwork, and it saves you a lot of
money.
Yeah, up to $1,500 or more per year by using Policy Genius to compare life insurance policies. So if you're looking to buy life insurance, or you're not sure where to start, head on over to policygenius.com. They'll get you and your family protected and hopefully give you one less thing to worry about.
So yes, I guess we have a lot to look forward to. Would be the glass half full, because we're type 0, as Professor Kaku talked about. We're hundreds of years away from probably being a type 1 and thousands of years away from being a type 2.
This is, and like I mentioned, this is heartening for me as opposed to disheartening for me, in that, like I say, the Homo sapiens have been here for 200,000 years, and all the progress we've made is basically to get to here. And he thinks in 100 years, 200 years, we could be a type 1 civilization. My gosh, like how incredible is that progression in 100 years compared to the last 200,000 years?
I'd love to see that on the news more, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so easy, as he talked about, that we get so focused on the present. And, if you're a Zen Buddhist, you'd say, well, that's where you want to be. You want to be in the moment. Mm-hmm. But we also get fixated on this particular time as though this is, this is the future of the species, is basically the next 10. No, it's hundreds of years, thousands of years, regardless of even what happens in the short term. We and the planet are going to be around a long time in some form. And it seems crazy, obviously, as we sit here today, that the energy that we use and harness is still, as he said, like, plants and fossil fuels. When you have
decaying
dinosaurs. And the focus on the sun isn't new, but hearing this, you think, man, if we really focused all our attention on solar power and then, further harnessing that power.
So we've got this enormous yellow burning ball of
energy,
fuel that I can feel on my face when I
Yes.
walk down the street. It's burning all day long.
Yes.
I mean, certainly our Earth rotates, but why are we not expending all our energy
Yes.
into capturing the energy from something that's free, something that's incredibly powerful, and something that's so close, rather than bugging around with all this junk underneath the dirt?
We're the only species in the world that actually has the ability to delay its own evolution. Because we've known this for 50, 60 years, that obviously there's a way to get solar power, make it ubiquitous around the world and essentially make energy as close to free as possible. But our focus hasn't been there. Our focus has been in other ways. And of course, once you have that link to your economy, nobody's in a rush to sort of change the status quo. And that's kind of been the case. I think, though, not only is the will there by most people, or many people around the world, I think it's starting to see that the political currency is there as well. So I think if we're doing the show in 10 years, it's a different story, because I think we're going to be way further down the line on way more solar and way less fossil.
Well, in 10 years,
yes,
we're 10 years closer to that, 30 years in which we're all going to die
Yes.
if we don't stop burning fossil fuels and treating the planet like
we don't have a great history as being proactive, but we have a pretty good history as being reactive.
Are we the only species that could end our own evolution as well?
I would think so. Outside of lemmings, I think lemmings can just run off cliffs.
But as a whole, I mean, all over the world, they can't coordinate their
No, I mean,
jump.
it's funny, because we're supposed to be the smartest species in the world, yet we have that unique ability, which is, you could argue, not smart.
Exactly. If you want more with Professor Michio Kaku, like we said, there's the full audio podcast. Click on the link below and you'll get about 20 more minutes with us and Professor Michio Kaku. It's going to be really interesting. Trust me.
Talking about the future of humanity, which we're kind of doing here, but of course, at a kindergarten level. So if you want to hear somebody who really has an incredibly visionary perspective on, and exciting and optimistic perspective on the future of the species, humanity, the planet, etc., you're going to want to stick around for this, because again, every time we talk to Michio Kaku, we usually leave, kind of smiling and feeling a lot better about things.
He's talking about things that make you happy, rather than, it's not the end of the world for him. It's the possibilities of what we can do.
Well said, Peter.
What are the possibilities of you coming back and watching another What If Discussed, maybe next week? Well, why don't you? Because this one's over. Thanks for joining us here on What If Discussed.